There is now a kind of a global digital coup economy, right? So it's not just the intelligence agent in the GRU in Russia anymore. You now have freelancers, right? So you have governments that can go and create these troll farms in Southeast Asia where people are paid, right, day in and day out to just, create content to influence communities. You have influencers who are local influencers who have organic and authentic followings who are now being paid by third party states to propagandize.
Woo, welcome. You have now entered Mad Warfare, mutually assured distraction, where we explore the weird, terrifying, and sometimes hilarious ways war is fought today, and how we can all protect our minds before we go too mad to find them.
Oh my!
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Okay, you talk if you haven't got a brain.
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Remember when the internet was fun? Cat memes, Rickrolls, all your base R belong to us. Now it's AI slop, rage bait, and platforms monetizing our collective nervous breakdown. Fun. Look, what used to be a playground is now a battle zone, where apparently all your brains are belong to us. How did we get here? Who's really running the show? And what are the rest of us supposed to do about it? You're about to find out. Welcome back to Mad. I'm Jocelyn Brady.
Missing the old memes. I'm Sean Guillory.
Guest today is an international lawyer, a Howard Law professor, and a former Pentagon, State Department, and White House national security professional. Oh, his new book walks us through how the systems we use every day got turned against us, and more importantly, how we get them back. Please welcome the author of Digital Coup, The Conspiracy to Thwart Global Democracy, spicy, Professor Darren Johnson.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here with you, Sean and Jocelyn.
Pleasure's ours.
So I want to get straight this career. Okay, you went from earning a law degree to serving at the White House, the Pentagon, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. And what is it actually like? Before we get into the serious stuff, is the coffee any good at the Pentagon? How does the parking work?
Well, I'm actually going to date myself, but I remember when the Pentagon, when we first got those new Keurig coffee machines and everybody was excited about the pods. I'm a tea drinker myself, but I heard it was pretty good.
Okay. I having been in all those rooms, I've asked so many questions about what the dynamics are like and whether any national security professionals are funny. But what did you learn about power and democracy and the kinds of things the rest of us don't get that firsthand look at?
Well, I had the privilege of serving at the Pentagon. I was actually in military service at the time. Right after I finished law school, I reported to duty at the Pentagon as a young Army second lieutenant working for senior civilian leadership overseeing the Army. And one of the things I learned at that time, which was a time that was got pretty hectic, right? Because I was there during 9/11 and everything that followed. What I learned is that our democracy is really rooted and grounded in your next door neighbor, right? Your friends, your family. Those are the folks that are serving in the military, the folks that are serving in our civil service. And it's really the decisions and judgment and actions of career civil servants, military officers that are a critical backbone of our democracy, and really good people trying to do the right thing under very difficult circumstances. That was a common theme that I saw throughout my time in public service.
It's like the community of everybody really dedicating their lives to this endeavor.
Absolutely.
For democracy. So your book, Digital Coup, it sounds like a very relaxing bedtime story. What kind of fever dream are we walking into here? What does a digital coup mean?
So as I define in my book, a digital coup is any attempt to thwart or undermine a democracy, including a democratic process or democratic institutions, by digital means. And the reason that I adopted that term digital coup was I really wanted to provide a framework and lens through which people could think about the different types of warfare that occur today digitally. Disinformation online, digital disruption of infrastructure, all of these different things are happening all the time, right? We're familiar with disinformation, we're familiar with cyber attacks, but what I wanted to focus on in this book was what does it mean when that disinformation and those cyber attacks are specifically targeted at undermining democracies? And so that's where the term digital coup came from and how I define it in my book.
And quite the timing now, like the rise of we're seeing so much, the Lego, the AI slop, the Iran Lego memes, what I'm referring to. But you had been working on this book for a few years, right? It's just like miraculously timed.
Absolutely. I've been working on this book for a few years, but it's really an outgrowth of scholarship that I've been doing, for close to a decade now. I first became interested in this issue, like a lot of America and a lot of the world, after the 2016 election, and after it was revealed that Russia had intentionally targeted our election through digital means, whether that was, intersecting with emails, right, and leaking emails and distorted emails to thwart public opinion, or whether it was the creation of false identities operating as actual Americans on our different social media platforms to try to stir up racial polarization, unrest, division, and to try to discourage folks from going to elections. And it was really my first awareness of the ways in which Russia intentionally tried to divide us racially and along other social lines was when I was reading the Robert Mueller indictment. This was before the Robert Mueller report came out. So I think it was around 2017 or so when his first indictments came out. And I was about to do a radio show talking about the indictments and what they revealed. And I'll tell you, as I read the indictments, I was just absolutely shocked because as the indictment revealed prior to the Mueller report, it revealed the fact that Russia had a very intentional, well thought out, well planned effort to intentionally divide America on racial and other lines in order to stir up unrest in the country, but also to undermine our faith in our democratic processes and institutions. And ever since I read that first indictment, I've been fascinated with this topic. I've sought to understand it more. I've written a couple of law review articles related to this topic and other ways in which digital tools are used to radicalize. And so it was through this research, through those topics, that I realized that there was actually a book here looking at the issue broadly.
Curious too, like what surprised you most that you're like, oh my God, people really need to know this? Because I think we're all familiar with, when our uncles send us memes from Facebook and it's like, maybe check the sources. But what shocked you about all this?
Well, so many things shocked me, right? So early on in researching this issue, one of the first things that shocked me was the fact that, over half, if not more, of the voting age American public had in some way interfaced with disinformation. And by disinformation, I mean information being put out online that was from a false source, meaning someone parading as someone else, whether that was a human agent or a bot, or, just false information being put out by someone who, is using their actual identity. Regardless of the source, right, disinformation is intended to disinform, to confuse, or to persuade, right? And so what shocked me was the fact that so many Americans had been exposed to and actually been targets of disinformation, often from sites that we thought were real. I realized that I myself was a victim, right? After the congressional hearings and other groups that studied this issue, it turned out that there were some sites that I followed that I thought were authentic and real that actually turned out to be Russian agents, right?
Yeah.
And so that was what was shocking to me, is that, oh, look, I've followed some of these sites myself and they seemed organic. They seemed like real human beings. And so realizing that, it just was made that much more apparent to me that all of us can be potential victims And the ways in which these sites operate, not everything that they post is about, disinforming or polarizing. A lot of times it's about posting organic or authentic seeming content to pull people in. And then when it comes to election time or other cycles, then using that following to send out information that can persuade, polarize, or divide. And so that was one of the shocking things, which was how widespread this effort was and how many people it touched. And then there are a lot of other shocking things that we can get into, but that's one that comes to mind.
Why the name of the book is also just so gravitating. I think for a lot of folks who kind of aren't in the space, it will bring up kind of that war framing that I still think folks don't see these social media and like publicly available information sources as, like a battle space. So that's going to help with that. For folks like us who have been around the block, we're like, oh yeah, like there's some folks in terms of cognitive security and things like that. But the thing that I think is shocking for that crowd is that a lot of things in national security, we focus on folks OCONUS or outside the continental U.S. and the kind of threats on that. Coup is something that's usually generated from within. It could be fomented, and a lot of the things you're talking about is how that is fomented from folks on the outside. But I think that aspect of, these things are coming internally, and a lot of the kind of defense is focused on external. I think that kind of aspect is actually pretty jarring and shocking in like the defense space. They're almost not formed to do that, and I think it just makes them generally uncomfortable. So again, that's why I really kind of like some of the gripping and jarringness of kind of like your titling and even some of the stuff you have in your book on that.
Yeah, absolutely, right. It's, the classic psyop, right? The use of a psychological operation on a community in order to drive a result, even if that result is not, actually a change in government, even if that result is, civil disruption. It's the fact that these operations are coming from outside of the country, aimed inside to lead to a particular result that I think should be concerning to all of us. One of the things that I've had to grapple with in doing this type of research over the last, close to a decade now, is in thinking about these issues, right? We all of us here in the United States are quite familiar with the fact that we have a lot of divergent political views. We have a lot of different backgrounds, right? Racially, religiously, we're a multicultural, diverse society. And so the idea that we have different people with different backgrounds and different perspectives is nothing new. And the fact that, those differing viewpoints find themselves in debate, right, in the public square is nothing new. But what was so disturbing to me about what I first discovered in researching these issues was the fact, it's one thing, it's kind of like family rules, right? It's one thing if you get into a fight with your brother or your sister and you kind of get into an argument or a tussle and then you make up. It's another thing when you have someone outside the family, right, come in and target you. It's just a whole other dynamic. And that's what viscerally bothered me. It's not that there's this difference of ideas being pushed, but it was the fact that there were people outside of the country studying us, studying our divisions, studying our fissures, and saying, okay, we're going to exploit those, right? And we're going to try to drive even more division to separate America, right? From my own perspective, we've spent 250 years trying to heal from and grow from our divisions. And the fact that we have others outside the country studying them and using them as opportunities for their own agenda just fundamentally bothered me. And so that was another of the issues that I kind of was grappling with. And just the reality that, in studying particularly the first major attack, which was from Russia, right, learning that they literally, hire agents and send them to a version of a school, right? They're engaged in, U.S. studies, right? So they have these agents studying different communities and studying and following current events and studying what the flashpoints are. And it just was just revelatory to me that folks understood that kind of doing a psychological analysis of America and Americans would then inform their strategies for how to divide us. I just, again, that was again shocking, but again, it shouldn't be surprising realizing that we have, psychological operations and propaganda, and Russia, has been quite studied in these tactics for decades, particularly going back to the Cold War. But it's interesting to see it manifest in a new form.
Well, it should say a lot to folks. Again, Russia in terms of geography is gigantic. In terms of amount of people, in terms of like economic power and how much they could put into the defense apparatus, they only have so much. So the fact that they're putting their very limited resources into getting these folks into the country and, and a lot of the times in influence and kind of like social media, that should say a lot in terms of what they think of the strategy and the efficacy
Absolutely.
of these kind of like tools. But one thing I don't want to let slip, because he kind of snuck it in there. I don't think he, not like a Trojan horse, but I do think it's actually worth bringing up. You did mention some things about like diversity and some things in terms of things like that, also in the context of like mis and disinformation. How you kind of framed it earlier. Again, you're talking about like the digital space as a battle space and digital coup. You were almost framing these things in terms of the lessons and almost the protections that we would get from like diversity and the things that we've grown in terms of as a liberal society as like tools and defensive tools in a way. I just want to almost like let you needle on that, because if it is something where a lot of that kind of, from the outside kind of thing, there's been a lot of talk in terms of, like DEI or these other things that, that we kind of took for granted in terms of, coming together and trying to better understand cultures. That's really been needled by a lot of, like disinformation or whatnot. But if you frame it in a way where it's like, oh, these are things that were actually helped to like protect our society, and they're purposely trying to go after those. So you just not only destroy them, but you almost just throw them away. You're throwing away your shield. You're throwing away your tank. You're throwing away, your big defensive barrier.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, based on your comment before, prior to that, which was that, it's amazing that Russia has invested so much money into this form of attack, right? It's the ultimate form of asymmetric warfare, right? So if you can't, beat someone with boots on the ground and with money and with traditional warfare, you find a way to undermine them, and a way that they're not paying attention to. And I think that with this form of digital warfare, Russia found the ultimate Achilles heel in America, right? Which is that we are a diverse and open society. We value our freedom of expression. And they said, okay, right? They have these unregulated open digital spaces, right? Where free expression is paramount. And they're an open, diverse society, which means there are spots of debate and division. So we're going to take all of those strengths that America has, and we are going to undermine it with this attack. And I don't think Russia necessarily knew, right, when it was pursuing these digital attacks. And by the way, I should say Russia started doing these digital attacks in Eastern Europe and other places, as far back as the mid 2010s, before they even did in 2016. But I don't think they even appreciated how successful that the attack would be in terms of the scope of those touched and influenced, but they said, let's try. But coming back to your other point, I always find it, quite ironic when I look at this past decade, right? And I was talking before about how the national security state in Russia decided that it was to their strategic benefit to study America, to study our different populations, subpopulations, to study current events and divisions in order to really understand the American psyche, in order to undermine us. And it's the same period in which we have these pushes, right, in different parts of the country, right, originally in states, to limit the type of topics that people could study in school, to limit education about our history or racial aspects of our history to actually make it illegal for schools to teach and have that conversation. And then we see that same kind of view of limiting discussion and honest conversation and diversity, and even limiting books and prohibiting students from having access to certain books. And you see that idea rise to, the forefront of this current administration, which is to limit attempts to have diversity, equity, and inclusion in our institutions. And in fact, to say that DEI is the problem. Whereas if you take a moment to think about it, right, if you have diverse, equitable, and inclusive institutions, whether that's at the federal government level, whether that's in organizations, you have more of an opportunity for people to understand diverse viewpoints, right? And certainly from my own perspective, I think one of the primary ways that you protect yourself from these type of racially divisive, demographically divisive attacks is to lower, right, the amount of social division, social animus within a society itself. And I think you only do that by proactively having conversations and addressing these historic divides head on, right? And so, to your point, I think where you're going with this, Sean, is that these attempts to get rid of efforts that have tried to target limiting discrimination, limiting inequality, limiting ignorance in our society about our history and divisions, it just opens us up even more so for these types of attacks. So I agree with what you were saying there.
But you said it way better than me, so I appreciate that.
Do you think, would it be fair to say, like, the sense I'm getting from this is because we have it coming from the top right now, that the shutting down of these kinds of initiatives of diversity, equity, inclusion, conversations about limiting conversations themselves, sort of the double-edged, the speak out of both sides of the mouth about freedom of expression, and yet here are the things you're not allowed to do and say and be. Is that a win for Russia?
I think so, right? It's a win from the standpoint that I think limiting efforts to have diverse institutions, particularly in government, particularly in the national security sector, it limits a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of viewpoints that would enable people perhaps to detect and to understand the types of attacks that are occurring. I also think that when we think about it, kind of taking a step back from, federal government and federal agencies, and we just look at it more holistically within America, limiting discussions, right, about our history, about the ways in which our diversity can be exploited, prevents us from being proactive in assessing, right, and responding to these types of attacks. And so I do think it opens up the door for places like Russia and other places that attempt to, weaponize our divisions. I do think it makes it easier for them when we're not having these honest conversations, or in fact trying to address the legacy of those divisions ourselves.
I'm going to be mixing analogies when I kind of explain this right here, but when you kind of take away those conversational ability, like it's like a combination of, as we're talking about battle spaces, like you're putting your own blind spots, and things will come out, and where they will attack next is where you are not looking and paying attention to. So it's a mix between blind spots, and you want to try to get as much visibility as you can, visibility and understanding. So hearing them out and what the counters are for those. But if you don't want to hear it, when it does come to you, it's just going to affect you even worse.
More ill-equipped.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We're going to ride this war analogy. Continue, Darren. Yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say, an example is, a great example is when we think about our vulnerabilities, right, to attacks, psyops, polarization attacks. Many of those polarization attacks are rooted in, things that Russia has studied are flashpoints, in America right now. Right. And so they look at those flashpoints and say, okay, well, we're going to take this issue and we're going to message to a particular community to kind of attempt to drive wedges, right? And so, I'll take the example of BLM, which Russia was, quite active when the Black Lives Matter protests were really active. There were all these different sites that Russia was putting out, basically putting out messaging to different constituencies about BLM, right? And on one hand, kind of trying to create narratives where BLM was seen by certain constituencies as this violent, this violent community that folks should feel threatened by, and also putting out messaging to BLM constituencies, right, trying to drive certain results. And what I take from all of that is, well, let's deal with the underlying issues that lead to the need for these protest movements. That means that let's actually take a fundamental look at the way in which policing is occurring in America, and the way in which certain communities are being impacted by unarmed or by police violence, right? Unarmed individuals being killed and targeted. Let's actually take that issue seriously and look at ways of addressing it, because we understand that if we don't, right, that is a site of redress and upset for a particular community, right? And that upset and lack of redress only creates another issue through which a foreign actor seeking to divide us can exploit it. So let's actually deal with the issues, right? Let's deal with the divisions directly so that we're not vulnerable to these attacks. Not only because it's the right thing to do, but also if we look at it from a national security perspective, because it protects us, right? It's protects the whole.
What's the brilliance in that? And I felt it when I was reading the copy of the book, which thank you for providing that to us. It's exactly what you said. It's weird, but folks on the Hill, there's this like weird divide between foreign policy and domestic policy. And there's folks that are like really smart in domestic policy, and then like, don't let them go to the Munich Security Conference, please. There's just this weird divide that they kind of like just treat them as two different things. Mm-hmm. What you're getting at is, again, these things that we can do in our community and get them together, that is actually helpful in national security. That is something that's going to helpful in terms of, even this outward kind of like quote unquote foreign policy, these things that you can just do at the community level, just human to human level that you could do with folks. That is a boon for your greater national security. And weird as it sounds, again, like, things like your book, there's just not a lot that are like that's focused on that. But how you just brought it up right there again, I think you're getting at that kernel.
Yeah, I mean, all of us that believe in our democracy, that believe in our democratic project, right, that want to see, America thrive and succeed for the next 250 years, that want it, and globally, right, that want to see successful, diverse democracies, right? I think it's important that all of us understand the ways in which these attacks are occurring, right? And they're occurring every day, but unbeknownst to us, right? And we haven't even gotten into generative AI, right? And as you saw in the book, generative AI just promises to exponentially metastasize this issue, right? There are now companies out there that offer services to governments, to people running campaigns, to candidates, right, where they will, create disinformation campaigns for pay, and they will provide all of these fake identities, right? And with generative AI, you now have fake identities that can cull images from the web and that study human behavior and make these fake agents seem even more authentic appearing, right? And so there is this potential that all of us, as we move forward, will continue to engage online. And if the controls are not in place, much of our engagement could be with a bot or a generative AI seeking to gain our favor, right? Have us develop a relationship with them so that they can be exploited when the time comes for either a government seeking to divide or someone seeking to use those services for whatever agenda they have.
Should we just wish for a solar Blair, or what do we do? How do we stand a chance against
How do we fight the digital
how
weapons?
fast
Yeah.
it's going? Yeah.
Well, so there are a lot of, I think, potential solutions, right? So first, awareness is key, right? So being aware of the issue, knowing what's happening through digital and social platforms. I like to say that a fair amount of skepticism and a degree of verification is something that can help us all. And so, if everyone is a little skeptical and puts extra effort into verification when they're online, I think that serves our individual and collective interests. But in terms of kind of what we can do more broadly and systemically, right? As you all know, we're all here in the United States. We know that we don't regulate social media. We don't regulate digital platforms. I don't see that happening anytime soon in America. But as we saw in the privacy space, right, it was actually the European Union, their regulations and their policies, right, something called the GDPR, which was a privacy regulation put in place by the EU, which now allows for all of us when we use our phone to decide whether we want certain information to be shared, right? The fact that when you go to certain websites, you get to choose what cookies are followed. Things like that, have flown from the EU's privacy regulations. And so right now, the EU has put in place a new regulatory rule called the Digital Services Act, which actually requires large social media companies operating in the EU territory to have content moderation practices and to report on those content moderation practices. And if they don't do so, they risk significant financial penalty if they want to continue operating in the EU. And what I suspect may happen is that requirement of content moderation will be something that hopefully those same practices will be adopted in the US and other places. And so I think this proactive requirement for content moderation, for continued reporting, for the formation of best practices, that EU regulation actually may end up saving us all, right? And there are other things that can be done locally, right? There are some countries that have gotten really good at it. Ukraine and Taiwan, which have been under sustained kind of digital coup attacks for a long time.
Yeah.
They've developed these quite sophisticated ecosystems of independent journalists, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and even pro-democracy hackers who work together to ensure that there's up-to-date, up-to-speed fact-checking as well as accurate information about information that is disinformation, right? And really trying to make sure that users are provided with accurate information as quickly as possible and that disinformation is called out and prevented. And so I think that combination of tools will help to protect the digital town square as we move forward.
But I have a question that a little bit we're kind of dealing with it, but I'm actually really curious about you as well in terms of I don't know when you started writing the book, but take our podcast, which we've been here for a little more than a year. When we were planning it, which would be in the fall and the winter of 2024, the things that we talked about in terms of disinformation and these kind of topics, the biggest thing for us is probably going to be new, this kind of framing for a lot of folks. Then not too long after we kind of started, things like even mentioning the word disinformation gasp or these kind of things is almost taken as like a rebellious sort of thing. So I was just wondering in terms of the reactions to your book so far, has there been a lot of shock, not just in what you're saying, but the fact that you almost have the courage to say it out loud? Has there been kind of some of those reactions that you've been getting from your book and folks who have been checking your work out so far?
Yeah, so the book just released last week, so I'm really excited that it's out there in the world, and so I'm getting inquiries and having conversations with folks. But as you know, Sean, I've been writing on these issues for a decade, right? So I've been having this conversation, and the issue of disinformation, right, has been a conversation that many people have had and been engaged in for quite some time. So I don't think that, I have not yet gotten folks who have been shocked about the topic. What I see a bit more, right, and which ties in with the goal of the book, is people, when I give talks about the book and the topic, a lot of people come up and they are surprised about how ubiquitous these types of attacks have become,
Okay.
right? Because one of the things that I talk about in the book is that these are global attacks, right? They're not. It's not just the United States in 2016. It's not just Brexit, right? This has become, to your earlier point, Sean. This has become the a form of attack, right? That many authoritarian regimes have viewed as a quite efficacious use of their funds, right? So it has become, I think, fundamental, right, to the ways in which many states seek to influence outside of themselves, particularly authoritarian regimes. And so I think a lot of people have been surprised about how ubiquitous it has become, right? How commonplace it is. And the other piece that, I was maybe not surprised to learn, but I found interesting and that I think people find interesting is that there is now a kind of a global digital coup economy, right? So it's not just the intelligence agent in the GRU in Russia anymore. You now have freelancers, right? So you have governments that can go and create these troll farms in Southeast Asia where people are paid, right, day in and day out to just, create content to influence communities. You have influencers who are local influencers who have organic and authentic followings who are now being paid by third party states to propagandize, right? And then, here in the United States, a big issue that happened in the past couple of years was that you had a lot of American influencers who apparently were quote unquote victims of disinformation exploitation, meaning they were being provided with disinformation. They may not have known it was disinformation, and they were passing it on to their audiences,
Oh, got it.
right? And so this issue really has metastasized, and there's really a digital coup gig economy out there, right? Whether you're a local influencer or whether you're someone in an actual troll farm, people are being paid regularly to engage in these types of operations. And so I think the fact that it's so widespread, so many, particularly authoritarian regimes, are using these types of tactics, and the fact that many people globally are being paid to become part of these schemes, right, is something that I think a lot of people find shocking.
When did troll farm become a career choice?
Yeah.
I think it probably coincided with probably crypto and supplement sales.
Right. You look at kids today, it's like the career day options are totally different
Oh, not
from
the
when we were
career.
kids.
Oh man. It's interesting though, you're talking about like regulation and all of that, because I think we're always trying to toe this line of how do we defend, how do we allow freedom of expression and all of that. And I keep thinking when you're talking about this about we're very mindful of our physical borders, and there's quite a large investment going into that. And we don't really hear or understand much about digital borders and should they exist and what would those look like? Yeah, just something that came up as you were talking.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, Jocelyn. And I think oftentimes when we hear, particularly in the United States, the First Amendment and freedom of expression is paramount. And one of the arguments that you hear from those who are opposed to, any form of content moderation or regulation, what they say is content moderation is quote unquote a violation of the First Amendment, or content moderation would undermine freedom of expression, without getting into the technicalities, which is that chosen content moderation by a company, preemptive content moderation is not a First Amendment violation, right? As long as it's not required by the government, it's not a First Amendment violation. But moving past that technicality, right? The issue that I like to bring up and that I've, brought up in, some recent media interviews is when we talk about freedom of expression, the question then becomes freedom of expression for who, right? Because in the United States, our going in assumption is that, yeah, of course we want freedom of expression. All of us want to be able to say whatever we want, whenever we want, and not to be restricted. Okay, I'll give you that. Let's say that we want, Americans or other human beings to have freedom of expression. The way I like to frame it, though, is freedom of expression for who, right? That assumption is that it's a actual human being that you're talking to. Is our conversation of freedom of expression also dealing with the fact that your focus on freedom of expression is assuming that the entity that you're communicating with is an actual human being? Or if it is a human being, that it's an authentic human being? Are we concerned about freedom of expression for an intelligence agent that's pretending to be somebody else and that's propagandizing and not sharing their actual views? Are we concerned about freedom of expression for a generative AI that's actually not a human being, but that's pumping out this information and these ideas because it's programmed to do so? So I think our kind of knee-jerk conversation that some people have against content moderation because of a fear of limitation of freedom of expression has not looked at the issue of freedom of expression for who. And even if we agree that freedom of expression for actual human beings communicating authentically should be protected, then that means we still have to deal with the issue of how do we prevent all these other entities from exploiting the digital space who are not authentic human beings communicating as themselves.
That's interesting. So we probably don't need to get into the bigger argument around like personhood for these bots for that. But the one thing that I will say that a lot of these kind of very free speech sort of zones, as soon as like an AI is enabled in those spaces, I find it interesting how quickly those AI turn to like very, lack of a better word, like, like Nazi kind of ideals, and that they have to like apologize. Go on.
No, I was thinking of Grok just like turns into a little racist piece of,
but it was free speech.
Yeah.
Trained off of X data.
Exactly, right? It's like you have the AI that, or really any algorithm, it's trained off the data, as Sean was saying, right? And so if you have, this, I'm gonna date myself, but when I was back in high school or junior high, I had a math teacher that I always said when we used a calculator, you can use a calculator, but remember, garbage in is garbage out, right? Same thing, right? You have generative AI, if it's being trained on garbage, right, or biased viewpoints, then that's what's going to be produced. And the question is, do we want to protect freedom of expression for an algorithm or generative AI that's been trained on garbage?
If they're trained on bots or agents that have an agenda to divide, et cetera, and like that makes all the more reason for some kind of content moderation or labeling, so at least people understand where the opinions have come from. I think X, I don't know if they're still doing it. Twitter X was saying the location of certain accounts, so you can kind of see like, oh, that's in Zimbabwe, and they're talking about like they're living in Kentucky. What's going on here?
Yeah.
I know hilarity ensued in that.
It also reminds me of a related area, which is there was, I think, a recent case of I'm going to get the country wrong, but I think it was a young man operating out of China that had created this fake profile. And he basically had become online. I don't know if it's YouTube or some other platform, but he had basically decided that he wanted to monetize an identity. And so he created this fake individual who was a female, right, with certain political viewpoints, who attracted a huge following. And he made
that's India. He was India. Now I know what you're talking about.
And he made tons of money off of this identity that he created, right? Because he realized that
he had a certain aesthetic.
There was an aesthetic to the identity, but he also realized that the messaging that he could design this identity to put out was attractive to a particular political constituency, right? And he made a lot of money off of it, right? And so I think people are becoming more and more sensitized to the fact that just because you are communicating with an avatar, it does not mean that the person behind that avatar is who they communicate themselves to be, but not everyone, right?
Do you think if you do talk about this book again, like forgive me for missing it, but do you think that something like digital IDs or identification would help? I can already immediately see, like on some of the privacy end, where that could be annoying, but
Yeah, no more Reddit.
something like that could,
Yeah.
yeah, culturally, yeah, like yeah.
It's that's a great question. I'm kind of of two minds on that, right? On one hand, I agree with the goal, right, which is to have authenticity in a form of verification and to make sure this is an actual human being who is presenting as who they are, right? So there's that value. On the other hand, right, and another part of the book that we didn't talk about is I talk about how social media and digital platforms, right, in kind of their early stages, played a really crucial role in many of the protest movements, right? When we talk about the Arab Spring and the kind of the pre-Arab Spring movements, a lot of those political dissidents communicated through social media, right? And it was that anonymity that allowed them to organize and to create these protest movements. And so, on one hand, we want to ensure human authenticity. On the other hand, right, there may be some benefits to anonymity. And I think that's something that we'll have to, kind of play with and struggle with and see, right, in what context do we want to ensure that there's some form of verification, and in what other context can we ensure that it's a human being using the site, but maybe there should be some anonymity allowed. And so I think that's something that we'll have to with over time and hopefully come to a set of best practices that both protect the integrity of kind of the digital space, but also protects the integrity of dissidents, right? And the need for anonymity, particularly in places where making certain statements and revealing your identity can be quite harmful. So we need to find a balance.
Excellent.
What do you think is a tiny practical thing that people can do right now with what's happening in this space?
A tiny practical thing. I would say to take a close look at the digital platforms and social media pages that you currently use, right? To do a bit of research on what their content moderation policies and practices are, and to find out whether, based on that research, you believe that those content moderation practices are actually filtering out, right, people that can be engaged in disinformation campaigns, or whether those practices or the lack thereof are emboldening and allowing for disinformation attacks. And so I think that would be a good first step. And then, based on what people discover, make a decision about whether you want to support and remain on that platform or not. And then, regardless of the platform that you're on, I think it's always good, as I said before, for folks to engage in a healthy bit of skepticism and verification with all messaging and communications that they're engaged in.
So before we let you go, Digital Coup dropped May 5th. Go get it, everybody. Listen, I'll say listen to it. I don't know. Yeah, get the audiobook, read it, engage before your next family dinner. Make it a family book club. Where do people find it? And where do they find you?
Yes, they can find me at darrenjohnson.com. I think we'll have that in your page. And on darrenjohnson.com, you can find me and you can find the book.
I have one last question. Where do you find hope?
I find hope in this communication, right? I find hope in the fact that people are interested in this topic, that they're engaging with it, that we're having conversations, and that we're collectively working together to pursue solutions that allow us to really take advantage, right, of social media and digital platforms, but to do so in a way that's responsible for our democracies as well.
to talk with you again.
Come and be inside my head. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the say. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the say. Cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me. Cancel me. Cancel me. I got things to say. You can cancel me.